and I'm going to welcome everyone. So, yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Scott Bremer, and I'm the co-vice chair of the Young Academy of Europe, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Zoom-based fireside panel discussion on the changing European landscape for early career researchers and early stage faculty over the past decade, with a view to the coming decade. So the working conditions and incentives for Europe's young scholars have significantly changed in the past decade. Scientific policies, norms, and cultures have shifted, at times dramatically, as we've witnessed across Europe, of course, during the pandemic, or in particular European nations through changes in government policies or practices, for example, in Hungary or Turkey, or, of course, very dramatically associated with the Ukraine war. And an increasingly active network of academies and advocates and other organizations have been very outspoken in helping young scholars navigate these challenges, the Young Academy of Europe being one amongst those. So in this moment, as the Young Academy celebrates its 10th anniversary, it is opportune to reflect on what has changed for early stage faculty in Europe, for better or for worse, and chart the most important changes we should pursue for scientific governance in the next 10 years. So last December, the Young Academy of Europe turned 10 years old, and to signify that, we held seminars of academic talks since February 2022, and today's event is the final seminar in this year-long celebration of this Young Academy of Europe milestone. So I'm going to facilitate today's panel discussion with 4 past and present Young Academy of Europe chairs about what they see as some of the most significant developments they perceive in this landscape. But before we start and I introduce our panel, I want to tell you that this session is being recorded and remind you to please mute yourself if you're not talking, but feel free to leave your cameras on. I will collect questions or comments for the panel, so please just write your comments in the chat and I'll invite you to ask them when we have time. So then, without any further introduction, let's start the discussion. I'll introduce each panelist in turn and ask them to give their first thoughts for 2 to 3 minutes on what they feel are the most significant changes to the European research landscape for early stage faculty over the past 10 years. So I'm first going to look to you, Mangala. So Mangala Srivnivasan is professor and head chair group leader of cell biology and immunology at Wageningen University and Research. She is also the CSO and co-founder of Senya Imaging BV, a spin-off company based on her research. Mangala was chair of the Young Academy of Europe from 2018 to 2019. Mangala, what are your thoughts on the past 10 years developments in the European landscape?
Well, thank you, Scott, for the introduction and the invitation. I think one of the biggest change has been the kind of wider and open acknowledgement that the system has flaws and problems involving, career stability, gender bias, workload, recognition and awards, career progression. And now all of these things are okay to discuss, and they're openly discussed at all levels, right? Not only with the more junior people, but also the more senior ones. At the same time, we haven't seen that much change on the ground. I mean, there are changes, but they're often inconsistent. They're not applied to the same levels. And even within the same institute, there's so much variability in how, for example, changes in tenure track systems assessments are applied, right? I think another significant change is the impact of COVID, of course. This really brought to the fore the inequality that exists in science. But at the same time, it also normalized working from home, which has helped a lot of us, especially in this stage of our life. So there've been a lot of pluses and minuses. And one last thing I'd like to talk about also is the recognition of the importance of mental health. To the extent that now you even see this in some of the grant applications, right? They specifically ask you to describe if you had any issues in the past, which I think is a big step forward.
Thanks very much, Mangala. So then I'm going to move over to Marcel Svart. So Marcel Svart is ICREA Professor of Theoretical Chemistry and Director at the IQCC Institute, the Institute for Computational Chemistry at the University of Girona. Marcel was chair of the Young Academy of Europe from 2017 to 2018. Marcel, what are your thoughts on the past 10 years with the developments?
There were actually two things which are really the most important things, which and which I was involved. One was the Resaver program for moving along with your pension along if you move from one country in Europe to the other. And of course, by far, the one which has provoked the most, let's say, discussion is Plan S and publication in general. So we now have also been discussing this a long time within the Young Academy and also within Academies Europaea. And in May this year, we're organizing a conference in Stockholm on the general topic of scientific publishing, where we have, in fact, have 8 sessions focusing on different aspects, one of which is on early career researches, and another is on Eastern Europe research, but also for funders, etc. But yes, so I think Plan S and the possibility or not to publish in open access, I think that is one of the main changes which has been happening in these last couple of years.
Thanks very much, Marcel. I'm going to move on to Monique. So Monique Tromp is a professor and chair of materials chemistry and director of the Zernike Institute for Advanced Materials at the University of Groningen. Monique is the current chair of the Young Academy of Europe. What are your thoughts, Monique?
Thanks, Scott. Well, I can only recognize what Marcel and Mangala has already been saying, but maybe add on a little bit. So Mangala spoke about acknowledgement of different career paths and that maybe the system wasn't quite right as it was. And we're moving forward, of course, and the whole recognition rewarding movement, both in some countries as well as at a European level, in, for example, COARA. But I think there we also have to be careful, and we play an important role as Young Academy of Europe in on one hand ensure that we don't introduce new biases in the system, but also that a lot of countries are not quite as far as others are. So there are countries which are far ahead in recognition rewarding different career paths, but other countries still look at age indexes, etc., and don't want to move away from that just yet, also because their governments are requiring those numbers. So I think we have to ensure that we look after early career researchers in different countries, and acknowledge the fact that it's not moving at the same speed everywhere else, and we have to make sure that these early career researchers in different places have similar opportunities, and sometimes they don't start from an equal system anyway, because the opportunities in their respective countries are already different. And I think this recognition rewarding open science, where Marcel referred to with Plan S, but it's getting much bigger, of course. Open science is not just open publications or open access publications. And I think another important topic which is linked to everything else is also social safety, so that we can work in a safe environment. And of course, the hierarchical system in the academia is tricky, and a lot of cases have come out also after the Me Too movements in other areas, and we have to look after our people and ensure that they can work in a safe environment. So I think there's a lot of things moving the right direction, but there's still a lot to be done where the Young Academy of Europe can play a huge role. So
thanks very much, Monique. And then I'm going to move over to Lynn. So Lynn Camerlin is a professor in Georgia Research Alliance Vasaruli Chair of Molecular Design at Georgia Tech and a professor of structural biology at Uppsala University. And Lynn was chair of the Young Academy of Europe from 2014 to 2015. Lynn, what are your thoughts on this? You're muted still.
Sorry. Thanks so much. So I think amongst many things that have changed, one is the existence of young academies at all. So I remember the very first YAI meeting, and this was in Brussels, well, 10 years ago, right? And it was at the time, we didn't really know what we were doing, any of us. I joined the board a few months later. But since then, in addition to the YAI, there have been these additional national young academies, which I think are highly complementary. And this has actually empowered people early in their academic careers to engage in advocacy, to basically give a voice and a platform that didn't exist before that to people at that career stage. And this is translated into many good ways. And I think the biggest thing, which is still not equal across Europe, but when I started my faculty position, I was on a 4-year fixed-term fellowship. There was no such thing as a tenure track in Sweden, right? And this was true in many European countries. So I remember at the first meeting ERC grantees who had no security of any sort beyond their ERC grant. They had a fellowship, they were there, and that's it. And so there's been a tremendous amount of pressure at the national level from national young academies, at the European level from European young academies, from the Young Academy of Europe, to push for clear career trajectories and clear career paths. Is it perfect? By no means, but if there is even a tenure track in many of these countries, it's not without pressure from young researchers, right? And so that's also an example of young researchers working together can make a difference and having a voice in advocacy. There's been also, I mean, this will come again now with COVID funding cuts, but one of the big things the YAI was engaged in early on was trying to protect European research funding, because politicians, whenever there's an economic crisis, the first thing they want to do is cut the research budget. And 2011 was still fairly fresh after the 2008 crisis, more will come. And we don't always manage to protect the budget, but every voice essentially contributes to keeping research funding going. And then the changing publishing landscape, which leads to valuation. So the push towards open science has also led to a proliferation of journals across different hierarchies. And so when I started my faculty position as a chemist, you published in JACS Angewandte or else, and that was the equivalent to biologist, Nature Science, Cell. Now there are lots of excellent journals. And so you're not in this situation where you're caged in. And so that impacts evaluation, because you start actually looking at things more broadly. It's not did they publish in one of these 2 journals or else. And so there is more option for career paths. Hyper competition remains a problem. When I was starting my faculty position, people would say, oh, if you look at professors 10 years ago and compare their CVs to ours, they would never have gotten a position today. And now in 2023, when I evaluate young researchers for prizes and positions and so on, I look at your CVs and I'm like, I'm not sure I would have gotten a position today. So maybe every generation feels like this, or maybe people are getting massively better all the time, which would be good. Research in Europe is strong, it's flourishing, people are doing amazing things, so we have a lot going for us. But of course, the problem is that you need support and funding and environments to make that happen. And things have improved a lot in the past 10 years, but funding pools have remained stagnant. There's like a lot of issues that still need addressing. And so I think the young academies have done a lot to help, but there's still a lot of work ahead.
Thanks very much, Lynn. So I want to just pick up perhaps on one of those points that you raised near the end there, Lynn, because it links to what was said by some others on the panel. Do you feel that there is a clear research career path for people who are perhaps finishing their PhDs and finishing their second postdoc and thinking they'd perhaps like to stay on and research in Europe? Do you think there's a clear career path for them? And has that career path changed in the last 10 years? What do you think? I see you nodding, Marcel. What do you think?
Well, basically from the European Commission side, there is a clear career path. So you do your PhD within, for instance, an ITN, Marie Curie ITN program. Then you move on to do a postdoc using a Marie Curie fellowship. Then you move on to another position with an ERC starting grant, and then you move on to consolidate again. So this helps. They have provided the means, more or less, to actually. And before that, of course, you had the Erasmus to actually do the master studies. So basically, they provided the means to actually have this career path available. It's not sure if it is the even possible for all to actually, or for anyone to actually get all of those at the same time consecutively, but it is there. Whether it's that in reality, I'm not sure.
Because that would kind of demand that a career path then is one of external financing, which may be a difference to perhaps 10 years ago. I'm not sure if you had if all researchers had to externally finance themselves through to a professorship. What do you other thoughts on this career path idea, Mangala?
I actually think it's a little bit different, because what we're seeing is that, I mean, and we all know this, academia is not the normal career path for people who do a PhD. It's certainly not the most common. And I think the focus is shifting now to teaching the PhD candidates more practical and transferable skills, not only to come up with a specialized research question, but really skills that they can apply in industry. And I think it's really important that universities gear ourselves towards doing that.
So career paths don't necessarily have to stay within academia.
They can't.
We don't have enough spaces for that as well. And I think a lot of people don't want to either. But I mean, we collaborated as YE with ISC, so the Initiative for Science Europe, also on this research career path. And there we also established exactly what Mangala is saying, that the majority, of course, leaves academia. And so you have to prepare them for other types of professions as well. Yeah.
Which I guess leads over to different types of assessment too, right? Because assessment ought not then be narrowly defined to your discipline, a career within your narrow discipline within academia. Do you think that assessment frameworks recognize that now? I mean, since we are kind of talking about, say, work for early career researchers, so people who want to stay working in research at least, do you think that these assessment criteria allow enough latitude for considering different careers within research?
I think there's still far too little mobility. It's unidirectional out of academia and not in. You do see sometimes people move from other paths into academia, but that's even worse than for people who are trying to stay in academia. So you'll see someone wins the Pulitzer Prize and they'll get a position in the humanities department doing, well, you know what I mean? You have to be like the top of the top in industry, at captain of industry, and then you might get invited back. So there are sort of less extreme versions of that, but still the people who come from outside academia back to academia, they've been way beyond average successful outside academia. And so I think that's kind of problematic. It's true that we have this fundamental that even within academia, there's still a very, very small percentage. I remember a Royal Society study a few years ago that showed that in the UK, of people who get PhDs in STEM, 99.5% will not be able to get an academic position. And so, I mean, that's problematic, but we don't have enough bidirectional mobility. And this is in itself problematic because I think academia can benefit from people who've been tremendously successful in industry, right? And this is also the same, we have this very narrow path in academia. Okay, you have a PhD, etc., etc., etc. But I look at friends and former colleagues, not former friends. And so they've been very successful in industry, and they're doing more or less the same thing that someone who got a PhD and then went into that job would do. I mean, after 10, 15 years of on-the-job training. So I think that's not just a European problem. I think globally there's unidirectional mobility out of academia, and academia would benefit from valuing experience in both directions so people can move in multiple directions. And finally, a statistic that people kept reminding me of when I worked with researcher career issues is that the majority of Europe's R&D occurs outside universities, and I think most people forget that.
Which again, so this means recognition and rewarding for other expertise and experiences that lie outside of academia, perhaps through narrative CVs. Do you think that could be one route we could focus on there? That seems to be something of focus at the moment.
Yeah, that's
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's fine. No, that is of course very much attached to this recognition rewarding, that you can emphasize why you have certain skills and why they are important for you at that stage of your career. So that exactly where that is for. At the same time, people still find it very difficult to write something and make a nice narrative. It's not, of course, so much about the narrative in that it has to be a nice story, but it has to be evidence-based. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about that. But that is a way where you can introduce all these different aspects and emphasize what is important at that stage for what you use your CV for at that point. Either it being a funding project or it being a different career step or whatever. So yeah.
But this would you then say this has been a move in the last 10 years? Do you think that there have been more efforts to open up the criteria for recognition and reward?
I think that is something which is happening right now, and then at different speeds in different countries. But also that's of course where the COARA coalition comes in, although COARA is very much on research assessment, but also there's a lot to be done. But in the Netherlands and in more countries, this is taken much wider. So the academic career path, which includes teaching, which includes social media presence maybe, or outreach, or teaching. And not everyone is good at all of these, and we don't necessarily have to be, as long as we have a mix of people who can deliver all of those.
This is a common frustration we hear from academics, isn't it? That, you know, that you're supposed to now be excellent in such a range of different skills, rather than, you know, perhaps previous academics who had a narrower set of skills that they had to excel at.
May I add one small comment on narratives? Narratives are conceptually good, but they open a completely different can of worms, because they feed into both gendered definitions of excellence, but also the problem is that it's very gendered. How not just, I mean, there's all this research on like letters of recommendation and the language people use for, say, women versus men, you know, minorities, etc. But narratives actually play into that as well. So the more senior you get, the more time you spend evaluating other people, and the more time you spend evaluating other people, the more you see clear patterns in. Obviously, people are individuals, right? So there's a distribution. So there are women and minorities who will be bombastic, and there are men who will be much more. But there's still kind of very clear differences in the distribution of how people will describe themselves. And then the problem is that because we work in a gendered framework, and sort of, you know, so how we then react to those narratives that we read, all our implicit biases come out. So the problem is, on the one hand, narratives move us away from like, okay, this is your H index, did you publish in Nature Science Cell? But they actually also take us into a whole new set of problems, right? So I'm not sure what the right solution is, but it's good to be aware that it's not without issues with narratives either.
Another theme I wanted to take up before we talk about what Young Academy is and other academies have done best in shifting this landscape was, I was very interested to hear that for you, Marcel, but also for others, actually the open science movement was one of the big changes in the landscape. And how do you think that's changed, what it means to do research for a young scholar compared to, you know, a scholar working 15 years ago, for example?
In one way, so it's not just open access. That has been with planners, for instance, that has been one of the most important aspects which has been discussed, but especially open data. This is one of the areas where young researchers actually will be able to get credit for in the future. So I think within the next 10 years, it will not only you have the different parts which will be evaluated, but also you will get credit for how much data you will get, how much data you will output, and this is mainly, I would think, even now produced by the young researchers, not by the full professors. So the full professors, they will get still the publications, just like are assigned to the PI, but the data, these are, I would say, more connected to the young researchers, to the early career researchers, and that would be one possibility to actually have the potential to have more impact. And for instance, in Spain, we already have now the obligation to actually publish all data related to a project in open data after 2 years at the end of the project. This is something new which wasn't there before. And you also see, as a result, you also see all kinds of new initiatives to actually enable to put this data. So to make open science more easily possible. That's also good for the young people to actually get more visibility.
And you were saying, Lynn, that it gives people more options as well, more alternative paths for publishing, so that you're not stuck in publishing in a standard format in a standard journal.
Exactly, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens with publishing moving forward. But even within the standard format, within the standard journal, so if science increases and you still have 2 journals and the very finite number of papers they publish, that just increases the arbitrariness, hyper competition, and etc. Right? So even going from 2 to 10 journals within that same tier, that kind of sort of massively increases your options as a scientist. So you're not, okay, I didn't get this into journal A, that's like the journal for my field, and I'm like now doomed, right? But I think also panels are not perfect, because who sits on panels? We do, right? So we have responsibility. And panels still look, oh, wow, you have Nature Science Cell papers. This is like, we need to move away from that. But beyond that, I think people are getting a bit more open-minded, looking at people's more holistic scientific output. We have a long way to go, but we started from a pretty bad baseline, so things are much better than they used to be, but there's still a lot to be done. And I also like to advertise that I have my position without having a single Nature Science Cell paper, so it can be done.
And Mangala, you started us talking about, you were talking about there being more recognition, or it being more transparent now, or more transparent discussion of the working conditions for researchers, though you didn't necessarily think that previous generations of the younger researchers from 20 years ago may have been facing the same conditions, but that it wasn't discussed.
That's, I think, to some extent true. I don't know that it was as competitive in the past. I think it is more competitive now. It's also a global competition, right? But certainly nobody talked about it, because it always looked like, you know, you were just really smart and so you got the position. But we've heard this also from some of our some of the more senior people, that in the past, you know, you would ask for money and basically you would get it, which is unimaginable now, because there's chances of sometimes 1 or 2%, right? But just going back to a little bit about what Lynn and Marcel were talking about, when we are assessing people on narrative CVs or so many other factors, it makes the task of the committees so much more difficult. It's much easier to look at a CV and go, oh, there's a Nature paper, must be good, right? And now suddenly you have to look at so many other aspects. And I don't know that people are trained for this. Committees often don't have the training to see this, not only unconscious bias, but everything. How do you assess someone in interdisciplinary research? It's not even close to your work, right? I think this is something that, at least in Wageningen, we are trying to implement, that people on committees do get some level of training, but it is inconsistent, and that remains a difficulty.
Monique, and then Marcel.
Well, I agree that the committees and panels need to be trained, but I think a lot of funding agencies and universities and even the ERC type are working on this. So they are making videos and instructions for panels. It doesn't take away the bias, of course, but if you're aware of it and you monitor that carefully, so I think this is going on at a lot of different places. So
Marcel?
Yeah, just to add that, but previously the panels were also not trained properly. And they were just easily going for the number of nature papers and science papers. But one of the things which I noticed being on these panels is that recently you really get much more, you're prepared much better. You get really strict ideas what you should evaluate. You get all these Rubicons, like, this is the things which we want you to focus on. And it's not just like the number of science papers. No, really have some impact in this. So it's much better defined. So the panels are prepared in a better way, because of also, of course, of the recognition and reward discussion which has been going on. I think this also leads to a much fairer evaluation.
Because the competition comes back to the fact that the competition is so much wider, more competitive, in the sense that there are so many more journals, so many more academics, so many more so much higher throughput of PhDs and postdocs now associated with projects. So you're not just looking in your own little network of people that you've bumped into at conferences. Suddenly you've got people you've never heard of, like you said, Mangala, from fields that are not really your own, and you're sitting on a panel for them. So it's it can't only be down to who you know anymore. No.
I think you touched on something very important, Scott, and it's something I always like to bring up. That we keep trying to solve symptoms and not the problem. And the problem is the hyper competition. And a lot of this toxicity is simply because there are too many people for too few jobs and essentially limited resources. So it's a bit like if you follow the news from tech right now, they kind of went wild and hired like crazy. So now they're firing like tens of thousands of people. Half of it is because they need to, and half of it is because they want to make a point. But I mean, academia did that, right? There's all this academic literature on post-World War II growth and stuff like that. And so I feel a lot of the toxic evaluation systems, the crazy working hours, everything else is simply because everyone has to be the Olympic gold medalist to get anywhere, right? And so what we really need to do is to step back and either we're going to increase the funding base, right? We're going to invest more money in research, more people should be able to get grants. You can do what NIH does. It's sort of, okay, you have this many R01 grants, it's very unlikely you're going to get more because they realize that giving people unlimited money kind of tails off, right? So if you have one group with like 5 R01s, they're not going to produce the equivalent of 5 R01s. And also the difficult question no one actually wants to deal, and the colleague of mine keeps pointing out, is we have too many students for the amount of jobs that are available. So either we're going to actively train everyone for alternate pathways and not, because everyone is brought in, you must become an academic, right? So, but getting to the bottom of that, I think, and trying to deal with the hyper competition, acknowledging other career pathways as equally valid. They are, but we need to do a better job of realizing that in academia and speaking of it. And I think as long as we have the hyper competition, everything else is just trying to put band-aids on.
Mm. I'm not sure if it's, I mean, you're all, well, two of you are working in the Netherlands. Well, you're spread over different countries and have different experiences, but I know here in Norway, they've tried to kind of, to add a little bit more, make an academic career a little bit less precarious by putting in place new kind of government regulations that say, okay, you can't just hire 1-year postdocs here and there. We're going to create permanent researcher positions, kind of senior researcher roles, and they have to be given work first. And only when there isn't work for them to do can you hire additional people at a university. Is there anything similar that you're aware of in other countries? This could be a rich Norway initiative.
No,
Sweden as well.
Yeah, so the temporary positions definitely, so that is anchored in new laws that you can't hire people for too many temporary positions and next to each other. But I don't think it necessarily looks at, like you said, first give the jobs internally and then only hire an extra one if that is, but I think the workload is high anyway. So we would want more people to go into the system and become permanent rather than solving, teaching, etc. with temporary 1-year, 2-year positions, which happens in some disciplines actually. Because the number of students, that is really a problem, as Lynn was also saying. So,
Marcel?
Yeah, we have in Spain, we have a new system where basically they wanted to get rid of the temporary positions. So now we have a new law for labor. But because in the universities we have so many short-term contracts with PhD students and postdocs, they were making exemptions for universities. And so basically now we can have positions that are indefinite with a fixed end date. So basically you get a permanent position for 2 years. That's like that. It's just a different way of describing it, but it's not changing the way that we are handling things.
Right.
So that's unfortunate, but yeah.
Again, just to the people not on the panel who are listening here today, again, feel free to add any questions or comments you might have into the chat, and we can ask those. I'd like to move on to the second question then, which is, what have been the Young Academy of Europe's most significant impacts on this landscape over this period? And I might say that the Young Academy of Europe usually works in conjunction with other organizations, academies, and so on. So it doesn't have to be the Young Academy of Europe on its own. What would you say are the most important contributions they've made over the past 10 years? I don't know who wants to start. Lynn, you were the earliest chair here. What do you think?
So again, I think just by existing and giving a voice to researchers across Europe, that's huge, because researchers, so when researchers were included at the discussion table, especially for policy, it was usually our much more senior colleagues, right? And so the Young Academy of Europe, the difference between the YAA and the national Young Academies is the European dimension, and the fact that it does really bring members. And so, for example, something that we haven't talked about so far in this panel is widening European participation. And that's something I cared really deeply about during my term as chair. And the YAA allowed us to reach into lots of inclusiveness countries and tried to mobilize our members. We had grant writing workshops in Wrocław. It gave a voice to our members to bring up the policymakers, the inequities and evaluation schemes and so on. So I think there the YAA has been really important. And then again, things like basically the career path evaluation, etc. The YAA has been in many of the tables where these discussions happened, but we wouldn't have done this also without the Young Academies pushing at a national level. And as you said, we work collaboratively, and that's a really big strength for all of us. And there are many members who are members of National Young Academies and the YAA as well.
Mangala, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a lot of the topics that others have brought up already, but maybe one thing to keep in mind is I've always felt that what you get out of the Young Academy is how much you put into it on an individual level, right? I think it's really a great opportunity to make a contribution, but also just to network and to meet great people. But it needs active members, right, on an individual level. On a more macro level, the Young Academy has been giving voice to a lot of issues, many of which we've raised already. When I was chair, we looked a lot at gender and diversity issues. We also looked at our participation in wider organizations like YASAS, where Monique is heading. It's a continuous process, and I think it's what I'm really happy to see is that the Young Academy now is accepted, because when I first joined it, I remember my colleagues were like, why are you wasting your time? You should be papers, you know? And that's no longer the case at all. And that's really, really nice to see.
Monique.
Yeah, maybe I can follow up on that. Like Mangala is saying, we're at the right tables. We're also invited at the tables. And that, I think, is a huge accomplishment. That whereas first we put ourselves at certain tables, we are now invited at the tables. And we're closely working with the European Commission, with the European University Association. I always have to think. And that we are part of this sounding board, and they think of us first when they go further. And of course, if I think about significant achievements, it's also definitely this, that we're now within the European Commission also in its science advice mechanism, and that is via YASAS, and that is 16 members working together as one partner, next to the senior academy networks, where it is still mostly white gray men, but it's the European Commission wants advice, scientific advice on problems which concern us. It's our future. And if it's just the white gray man delivering advice, and of course they say the science is the same, but yeah, how you interpret it and what you do with it is very different from different perspectives, and this diversity, so not just age, but also cultural background, gender, is key to deliver a good advice. And there's sound literature on that, but people try to ignore that sometimes. So I think definitely that we are being recognized as being important in the European landscape.
Marcel, do you have anything you want to say?
Yes, so indeed, so the scientific advice mechanism with SAPIA, I think this is one of the big areas where the Young Academy over the past 5 years has played a big role. in most of the topics most of the advices that were coming out in those years. There was chair. There was usually at least one Young Academy member as the early career researcher involved in providing the report. And of course, Nicole Grobert, so our former chair as well, that she was the head of the, I would forget I still haven't had the high level group. It's now called the Chief
Scientific Advisors. Yeah.
So she was leading this for, I think, 2 years. I think she now retired or is going to retire too. But this is one of the areas where we were indeed one of the big contributors as Young Academy. But also in other parts, so like the framing of Framework Program 9. The Young Academy members actually joined together to actually write an advice on what are the things which need to be done. So less administration, all kinds of aspects. And this was really well received by the European Commission, and they took it into account in many ways in the final drafting of New Horizon Europe. And another one is actually one meeting I went to with Lynn in Brussels on open data at some point, where they were discussing how open data would be in 2030. And there was some part of the European Commission which was actually pushing for that the moment that you generate data, that you should be made open. And well, we do stress a lot about, yeah, this is something which you cannot do. There is no way that you can actually make my airport fell out, and that you can impose top-down policy for open data, because every discipline has their own way of handling things. Every community has their own format for what is important in the data. So that is something which came out of that discussion. This was taken along in the policy advices afterwards on open science. And I think that's the aspect. Whenever we have contact with the European Commission, they're really really thankful for the input from the researchers, and the Young Academy is playing the major role in that aspect now with YASAS even more, because now it's not just our members, but you have the national Young Academies, which are basically joining together to do that. So I think that is one of the big parts.
And one thing we were talking about actually earlier today in the board of the Young Academy of Europe was the proliferation of these kind of advocacy groups. So one thing that you said was one of the big changes you'd seen, Lynn, was that there was this rise of young academies, that there was starting to be a voice. And then you've all said that that voice is being heard in different arenas, which is fantastic. My question would be, do you think that the voice of these young academies is still being heard over the noise of, I mean, at this kind of very complex landscape now of different organizations associated with the European government or with national governments or academies? I mean, it's very complex now.
It is very complex, but many of these organizations don't implicitly have early mid-career researchers as part of that. Though they search for them and then they find us and they find YASAS now, start to find YASAS. Of course, YASAS is very much focused on SAPEA for now. But yeah, it is a complex mix, but we see that we are invited at the tables because we do represent this early mid-career researchers, which a lot of other organizations do not have or do not have explicitly. So
I think in a way it has become cool for these kind of boards to include some kind of young academy, whether it's a national or regional, or nowadays, I think it's becoming more of the exception to see big decisions made where some is not consulted, which I think is really, really nice.
And what about young scholars, early and mid-career researchers? Do you think that they are aware of young academies, are connecting with young academies? Do you think that their voices are or that they are spoken for by young academies?
I think that these surveys which the Young Academy has been doing the last couple of years really played a big role in helping get the feedback from the young researchers. I think that was also in what they came up in Nature in the news and views section. And I remember that the first time that we did the survey on the problems which early career researchers had in 2017, 2018. Mangala knows more about that. But the first time that we actually got the results back, I was shocked. I was shocked how many problems that all of these talented people had. And there's also, we had a meeting in 2017 in Budapest, where we had a workshop on time management. And with this workshop, actually as a startup session, we were just doing some exercises, and we had to run from one part of the room to the other, depending if you're in social sciences or whatever. But also one of the questions was, how many of you have a permanent position? And I think that's only 30% of the people in the room went to the part where actually yes. And I was shocked, because this was, well, 75% of the members of the Young Academy are EOC. And I was expecting, because these are top researchers, you would expect that they would have a permanent position or close to it. And that was not that left. So that was, even for me as a chair at the Young Academy at that time, this was a complete shock.
Mm-hmm. What about you others on the panel? Do you think that the Young Academies speak for early career researchers, or that they feel that they're spoken for by Young Academies?
Well, I think in a lot of countries, I know, and also why it is sometimes seen like that it's kind of an elite group, huh? So we select our members and their criteria, and so that we don't always represent the wider group of early and mid-career researchers. And I think there is still work to do, that we ensure that we get their views and also their struggles clear. And I think we're trying to do this. But this is sometimes the perception, and even in the senior academies, they feel that they are representing, the white male represent everything. I think we have to look at ourselves as well, also, and this role that scientists can play in science advice, like the science advice mechanism we're now in, that is not known to a lot of people. That's not even known to a lot of senior academics. So there is a lot to do as well, which is actually also part of the new SAPEA project. So this scientific evidence for advice at the European Commission. There is a big project there within on communication and outreach, etc. That is also an important role for scientists. And of course, that then has to be recognized in their career paths, because that is then the next problem. But yeah, so I think there's still a lot to do. Yeah.
A very kind of concrete, practical question we have in the chat from Mohammed. Is it 5 years one could linger as a postdoc across Europe? I heard North America doesn't impose any bar on that also. I guess that's the thing. How long can you languish as a postdoc nowadays in Europe? Or how long does it kind of, after how many postdocs, or you have found something? Or is there no limit to this?
There's no limit to it. But basically, I know some people that have been on a postdoc position for 6 or 7 years, and now got a postdoc fellowship for another more years. So it's, yes, it is. There is no limit.
Sorry, not in the same place, right? I think you do need to keep moving institutes or something, because you won't get a permanent contract as a postdoc. So then
mostly at the same place. Let's put it like that.
It depends, I guess, on the country as well. So in Sweden, you can only apply for a postdoc within like 3. I think maybe they've expanded to 5 with parental leave years of getting your PhD. And then the postdoc position is a 2-year position. And then you could become a postdoc at another institute, but you still have to be within 3 years of your PhD. And then you go into the senior researcher positions. But the one problem with the senior researcher positions is they sound, at least in Sweden, they may be implemented much better in Norway, but the Swedish version, they sound great, right? You get a permanent position after a short period of time. But the problem is that it's a catch-all position for everyone who's not faculty track. And so it's really everyone from basically more senior postdocs to equivalent of full professor without a faculty position. And as you get more senior, what ends up happening is you're in this permanent position. You're given the duties and responsibilities of a full professor, including a workload, you're managing a graduate program, whatever, you're doing the things that you'd expect a full professor to do, but then you don't get a vote in the department. So it sounds good, but there's a huge risk that this becomes quicksand of actually keeping even more people away from the faculty track.
No, that echoes what we're seeing in Norway, actually. Yeah. So we have 5 minutes left for the third question, which is forward-looking. So based on what we've been discussing, some of the advances, maybe not only advances over the past 10 years, and the different contributions that Young Academies have been making, what do you see are the most critical changes that the Young Academy and other academies need to affect to this landscape over the next 10 years? Where should we focus our efforts? Where is there most work needed to be done?
Well, you can also start.
Bengala.
Actually, I had a suggestion for you, Monique, or question as a current chair. I mean, we still have a lot of the old problems are still there. It's not like we solved everything we were working on 10 years ago, not even close, right? We've made a lot of progress, but a lot of the work of the Young Academies has been focused on improving the situation for ourselves, right? Or for our fellow academics. But what about looking at things like making our labs greener? I think things like that would also be really nice for the Young Academy to look at. Or do you think it falls outside of our remit?
That's a good question, actually. It's just for a certain discipline, of course. So that's not for, and at the same time, I think a third or maybe even more of our academics are in the physical science. At our membership at the moment is in the physical sciences. I think sustainability in general is something we really talk about in the board now. Also that we don't necessarily want to travel for an 1 hour handover in the other side of Europe, and that we all fly in and hand over a report and 5 minutes later we all disappear again. So this is definitely part of what we're trying to do and also what we're thinking about. The greener labs, it's a good point. I mean, I don't know if that is a role of the YAE. I think sustainability in a broader sense is a role where we can play a role and be active. Yeah.
What about you, Marcel? What do you think might be an important focus for the next 10 years?
Yeah, so the sustainability is something which is also within the Academia Europea. There's a task force for that, and that is
with
something
also members of the Young Academy of Europe. So it's a combined task force, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So that is something where I think both the old and the Young Academy should play a role. And well, the whole YASAs and recognition and that sort of thing, that is something where lots of things still need to be defined. Mm-hmm. And for sure, there will be many aspects where things may be decided by the gray old white man. And for that reason, the Young Academy should play a big role in that. And well, you are within the Coara and other things. And there will be many things where there will be things going wrong, I'm sure. And just getting this right is something which is needed, and where the Young Academy will play a role and will be needing to play a role.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about Coara, Thomas is in the audience today, and he's of course in the steering board. He from the Young Academy of Europe, but the Young Academy of Europe will I think because we're part of the coalition, be involved in a lot of the working groups, and this whole research culture is a huge thing. Of course, we've only just started, so we kind of agree now that we want it changed, but how and how then people, I mean, we mentioned all these problems in this hour. I think that there's a huge role indeed. And then the advice, as Marcel was saying.
Lynn, what do you think?
So I echo a lot of what's been said. I think one of the first things I did as chair of the YA was have to fight for the European budget. And you, the next generation, with COVID and everything else and political instability and strife, are going to have to fight for the European budget for research. So that's kind of a bit sad, but this will be a never-ending cycle. If you don't, they'll just slash it. I think one thing to think about moving forward. So when the YA started, everyone was an ERC grantee. Hello? Okay, sorry. So when the YA started, everyone was an ERC grantee. And that actually did not help the YA's image, because anyone who competed with us or didn't like us or whatever just described us as a snobbish club for ERC grantees. And the good thing is that there was a conscious decision. Initially, it was easy to evaluate excellence because, okay, you have an ERC grant, fine, check. It, right? So we expanded, during my term still on the board, we expanded our membership criteria to broaden who could participate. Now, if you look at the demographics of ERC grantees, there are huge gender and geographic problems, the worse, the more senior you get. And the problem is that the membership of the YA, even without being limited to ERC grantees, tends to reflect some of the same demographic issues. So if you look at this panel today, I mean, I think we've raised and discussed important issues, but where are we from? Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, Spain is still comparatively. So I think it's important for YA to remember that the YA is a young academy of Europe, and Europe also includes Belarus, it includes Ukraine, it includes Bulgaria, it includes Slovakia. And if you have young researchers from these countries, they will have very different things to say about what we've discussed on this panel, because they have much less career insecurity, much more career insecurity, much more political tension. There are huge threats on academic freedom. There's an active war going on, and so on. And so I think as a young academy, we have a responsibility for researchers across Europe, and it's really important not just to widen participation, but to be also a voice for researchers and have membership and have them be a voice for countries where they have issues that are very different from the ones that we worry about.
Just to reassure you, Lynn, that was most of our board discussion today, actually, and we have board members. I mean, Katalin is there. We work with other organizations where we really, well, we also put petitions out to commissioners, etc. We make statements. We really talk about this, and we try to do this. It's hard, but it's very much on top of the agenda.
So this is provocative, but the European Council recently made a statement by having a summit in Kiev, and it was very deliberate to go there despite the current situation. So maybe I don't necessarily recommend that the YA have a meeting or symposium or something in Kiev, but that's the kind of thing that makes a real statement of support.
That brings us to the end of our hour. We knew that it would go fast. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds if there's one last thing you would like to say about where you'd like to see young academies go now. Otherwise, and then we'll wrap things up. And thanks everyone for coming and joining us today. But I'll just go anti-clockwise from Mangala on my screen. So Mangala, do you have any last words? You don't have to have them.
No, we've been talking a lot already, and I'm just really, really happy with the way the Young Academy, it's still here, which wasn't always certain, and it's really nice to see that we are still working hard and making a difference, and it's becoming more accepted. I think that's very reassuring. And thank you again for organizing this.
Marcel, do you have any last words?
Yes, so two things. One thing is that with the move towards EU13 or Eastern European countries, there was also the collaboration with the ERC and COST to actually try to make to stimulate this. So that's one thing which should be continued, just grouped together with all kinds of other initiatives. And one thing where the Young Academy has made a difference, especially with compared to the old academy. In the old academy, the percentage of women is around 18%, if I remember well from last year from Gemma, the percentage in the young academy is around 43%. So that's really the future. So keep it up.
Monique, you're next on my anti-clockwise circle.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what to add, actually. I mean, it's a lot of where we should go. I've said where I think we are going and what we're doing. So I think I've said what I want to say. So
Perfect. Then Lynn, do you have anything you would like to add?
Just that the AI has come such a long way since 2012. And I think Andre would have been very happy if he could have seen what everyone's achieved. And it's been great to see it passing down the generations. And also, yes, there's a lot to be concerned about, which comes in this discussion, but Europe has a new generation of amazing scientists and amazing academics and amazing researchers. So the future is bright. Let's just keep giving a voice to this generation so they can continue carrying the torch moving forward.
Very nice. And with those final words from all four of you, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along today. It was a really, really nice discussion. Thanks very much. We really spanned this very diverse landscape. We got across a lot of it. Thanks for joining, everyone. And this is being recorded, so we'll also put it up on the Young Academy YouTube channel, right? So if you want to send it on to any of your colleagues later on, feel free to do so. Thanks very much for everyone for being here, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for organizing. Bye.
thanks, everyone.